Settle in with me and let the modern world fade away for a while. Stay with this story because within it lies a forgotten blueprint for survival, a testament to the quiet triumph of human ingenuity over the absolute cruelty of nature. Let us know in the comments below if you have ever faced a winter so bitter that the cold felt like a living, breathing enemy, an adversary that sought out every crack and crevice in your life. This is a story about a time when the wind had a will, when the earth was the only blanket that mattered, and when one quiet man looked at the frozen world around him and decided that conventional wisdom was nothing but a monument to freezing. It is a narrative of profound resilience, demonstrating that sometimes the most advanced technology is not made of steel or glass, but of dirt, roots, and the profound understanding of how the world actually works. In the late 19th century, the high plains of the American West were a landscape of breathtaking deception. During the brief vibrant summers, the endless oceans of prairie grass offered a siren song to thousands of hopeful settlers, promising fertile soil and boundless opportunity. The horizon stretched out in an unbroken line of green and gold, inviting men and women to stake their claims, to build their wooden houses, and to conquer the vast, open emptiness. But when the autumn faded and the winter arrived, the true nature of the territory revealed itself with a terrifying, lethal suddenness. The winter on the plains was not merely a season, it was an apex predator. It was a relentless physical entity that descended from the Arctic North with nothing to break its momentum for 1,000 miles. There were no mountains to deflect the wind, no ancient forests to shatter the gales, no deep valleys to offer refuge from the sweeping, screaming storms. There was only the flat earth, the gray sky, and the cold. The wind swept across the Dakota Territory with a velocity that could strip the breath from a man's lungs and freeze the moisture in his eyes before he could even blink. It carried with it a fine, crystalline snow that did not fall from the sky so much as it drove horizontally across the land, a blinding, scouring abrasive that could polish a wooden post down to the bare grain. The conventional wisdom of the time, brought westward by men who had grown up in the sheltered forested valleys of the East, was entirely inadequate for this brutal new reality. The settlers built what they knew. They built balloon frame houses out of milled lumber shipped in on the newly laid railroad tracks. They constructed tall, proud two-story homes with steep roofs, large windows, and clapboard siding, seeking to impose their Eastern sensibilities upon a landscape that cared nothing for their aesthetics. These wooden houses were, in the face of a prairie blizzard, little more than sieves. Sawn lumber, no matter how tightly joined by the carpenter's hammer, shrinks and warps in the dry, freezing air. The iron nails driven deep into the studs acted as thermal bridges, conducting the bitter cold directly from the outside air into the heart of the home. When the temperature plummeted to 30 degrees below zero, frost would form thick and white on the interior walls, creeping across the floral wallpaper and turning the inside of the house into a glittering, freezing tomb. To combat this, the settlers relied on cast iron stoves, feeding them constantly with twisted knots of prairie hay, dried buffalo dung, or precious, expensive coal. But the heat generated by these stoves was entirely localized and fleeting. The moment the fire burned down, the wind outside would strip the warmth through the thin wooden walls, leaving the inhabitants shivering beneath piles of heavy quilts, listening to the agonizing groans of the timber as the house fought a losing battle against the gale. It was a reactive, desperate way to live, a constant, exhausting struggle to generate enough heat to offset the massive, continuous losses. None of them noticed that they were fighting the environment on its own terms, trying to push back an ocean of cold with a single flickering bucket of fire. None of them noticed, that is, except for a man named Elias Vranik. Elias was an immigrant, a man who had crossed the ocean from the deep ancient valleys of Bohemia, carrying with him a heritage of practical survival that predated the Industrial Revolution by centuries. He was a quiet man, broad-shouldered and thick-waisted, with hands that looked like they had been carved from old oak, possessing knuckles like walnuts and palms calloused into stiff leather. He did not speak often, and when he did, his words were heavily accented, measured, and stripped of all unnecessary emotion. He was an observer. While the other settlers gathered in the mercantile to boast of the great wooden houses they were building and to complain bitterly about the lack of timber, Elias stood at the edge of his claim, watching the land. He watched how the prairie dogs burrowed deep below the frost line to escape the surface temperatures. He watched how the snow drifted behind the slightest rise in the terrain, creating natural, insulating blankets over the dormant grass. He understood, with a deep, intuitive grasp of natural physics, that the earth itself was a massive reservoir of thermal energy. The ground below the surface remained at a constant, stable temperature, oblivious to the screaming blizzards above. Elias had built a large, sturdy barn when he first arrived, prioritizing the survival of his draft horses and his small herd of dairy cows over his own immediate comfort. The barn was a massive structure of thick pine boards built to keep the driving snow off the backs of the animals. But Elias knew that a wooden shell, no matter how large, was not enough to protect his wife and their 3 young children from the lethal depths of a high plains winter. He looked at the small pile of lumber he had left over, then looked out at the endless expanse of thick, deeply rooted prairie grass. He remembered the old stories of his grandfather, of the ancient stone and earth dwellings of the old country, the house barns where families and livestock shared a single massive structure to pull their warmth against the harsh winters. He knew he could not build a stone house here, for there were no stones to be found in the deep loess soil. But he had earth. He had an infinite supply of the most effective, massive insulating material in the world, bound together by thousands of years of dense, tangled root systems. His idea was entirely unconventional, born of necessity and a profound understanding of thermal dynamics. He decided he would not build a wooden claim shanty on the open prairie to be battered by the wind. Instead, he would build a small, heavily fortified room made entirely of sod. And he would build this sod room entirely inside his massive wooden barn. When Elias began his work, the autumn air was just beginning to carry the sharp metallic scent of impending frost. He hitched his team of heavy draft horses to a specialized breaking plow, a heavy iron implement designed specifically to slice through the dense, impenetrable mat of the prairie turf. He drove the horses slowly, methodically, cutting a continuous ribbon of earth exactly 12 inches wide and 4 inches deep. The sound of the plow tearing through the ancient roots was a deep, resonant ripping noise, the sound of the earth reluctantly yielding its armor. Elias walked behind the plow, taking a sharp spade and chopping the long ribbon of turf into uniform rectangular blocks, each roughly 2 feet long. These were not mere clods of dirt, they were dense, heavy bricks of soil and woven roots, each weighing nearly 50 pounds, held together by the incredible tensile strength of the bluestem and buffalo grass. The labor was monumental, a quiet, grueling testament to his determination. He loaded the heavy sod bricks onto a low sledge, dragged them into the dim, echoing interior of his large wooden barn, and began to build. He chose a corner of the barn that faced south, maximizing the potential for whatever weak winter sunlight might penetrate the small windows he planned to install. He laid the first course of sod directly onto the packed earth floor of the barn. He laid the bricks grass side down, a crucial technique he understood implicitly. By placing the grass side down, the roots of each brick would grow slightly into the soil of the brick below it, binding the entire wall together into a single, monolithic mass as it settled. He built the walls an astonishing 3 feet thick, laying the bricks in alternating, overlapping courses, staggering the joints just as a master mason would stagger kiln-fired clay bricks. This ensured that there were no continuous vertical seams through which cold air could penetrate. As the wall slowly rose, foot by agonizing foot, the local community began to take notice. Neighbors riding past on their way to the distant township would rein in their horses, peer into the wide double doors of Elias's barn, and stare in absolute bewilderment at the strange, dark structure growing within the shadows. The primary voice of skepticism belonged to a man named Silas Thorne. Silas was a man of considerable means, a merchant who had arrived on the plains with a large sum of capital and a profound belief in the superiority of modern civilized architecture. He had built the largest house in the county, a towering 2-story Victorian structure with ornate millwork, a steep gabled roof, and tall, single-pane glass windows. He painted it a pristine white, a stark, arrogant contrast to the muted browns and grays of the prairie. Silas rode his fine bay gelding into Elias's yard one crisp November afternoon, dismounted, and walked into the barn. He watched Elias, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the chill in the air, heave another massive 50-pound block of earth onto the rising wall. Silas let out a short, sharp bark of laughter, a sound completely devoid of humor, filled instead with the condescension of a man who believes he possesses superior knowledge. "In the name of all that is holy, Vranek, what madness possesses you?" Silas demanded, gesturing with his riding crop at the thick earthen walls. "You are building a dirt hovel inside a stable. You intend to house your wife and your children in a cave, surrounded by the stench of cattle and the filth of horses? We are civilized men, Elias. We build houses of wood and glass, homes that stand tall against the sky. We do not burrow into the dirt and live with the beasts like primitive savages." Elias did not stop working. He carefully adjusted the heavy sod block, ensuring it sat perfectly flush against its neighbor, before turning his dark, quiet eyes toward the wealthy merchant. He wiped the dirt from his brow with the back of his massive hand. His response was laconic, purposeful, and direct. "Wood is a sieve, Mr. Thorne," Elias said slowly, his heavy accent wrapping around the words. "The wind will take your heat, the earth will hold mine." Silas shook his head in sheer disbelief, his face flushed with the arrogant certainty of conventional wisdom. "You are a fool, Vranek. When the winter comes, you will be shivering in this dark, damp hole, choking on the smell of manure, while I am sitting comfortably in my parlor beside a blazing coal fire. If your family freezes, it will be by your own stubborn ignorance." With that, Silas turned on his heel, mounted his horse and rode away, eager to share the joke of the mad bohemian with the rest of the township. But Elias was not mad. He was operating on a level of practical physics that Silas Thorne could not even begin to comprehend. Elias understood the profound difference between insulation and thermal mass, and he was utilizing both to create an impenetrable fortress against the cold. The scientific principles at play in his design were elegant, forgotten truths of survival. First, there was the outer shell. The large wooden barn, while entirely inadequate to hold heat on its own, served a vital, singular purpose. It stopped the wind. By building the sodroom inside the barn, Elias completely eliminated the devastating effect of convective heat loss. The ferocious blizzards that would strip the heat from Silas Thorne's tall white house would crash against the outer walls of the barn, leaving the inner sodroom sitting in a pocket of perfectly still, dead air. Second, there was the principle of thermal mass. The walls of the inner room, 3 feet thick and made of dense, heavily compacted earth, possessed an immense capacity to store heat energy. Unlike a thin wooden board which transfers heat almost instantly from the warm inside to the cold outside, the massive sod walls would absorb the heat generated within the room, holding it deep within the dense soil and slowly radiating it back into the living space over a period of many hours, even if the fire went out entirely. But the true, absolute genius of Elias's design, the element that Silas Thorne found so repulsive, was the integration of the livestock. Elias was not merely sheltering his animals, he was harnessing them as massive biological furnaces. A single 1,000-pound draft horse or a mature dairy cow generates a tremendous amount of metabolic heat simply by standing, breathing, and digesting roughage. Through the complex process of enteric fermentation in their massive stomachs, a dozen large animals continuously radiate thousands of British thermal units of heat into the surrounding air every single hour. Elias had constructed the sodroom in the center of the barn, leaving a wide aisle running completely around it. In this aisle, he built the stalls for his horses and the stanchions for his cows. He then engineered a brilliant passive ventilation system based entirely on the principles of convection. He knew that a completely sealed sodroom would become dangerously stagnant, trapping moisture from breath and cooking, which would eventually condense and freeze. He needed fresh air, but he needed that air to be warm. He installed small wooden intake vents near the floor of the barn's outer walls. The freezing outside air would enter the barn, but before it could reach the inner sodroom, it had to pass over and around the massive warm bodies of the livestock. The animals preheated the air. This warmed air, naturally rising as it expanded, was then drawn into the sodroom through a series of baffled vents placed near the ceiling of the earthen walls. Inside the room, a small, highly efficient cast iron stove with a tall chimney that exhausted straight up through the barn roof created a natural draft, constantly pulling the preheated fresh air into the living space, circulating it and venting the stale air outside. It was a continuous passive heat exchanger driven entirely by the body heat of the animals and the natural laws of thermodynamics. By late November, the Korsgaard winter room, as the few sympathetic neighbors began to call it, was complete. The interior of the sodroom was surprisingly bright and incredibly clean. Elias's wife, a stern but deeply loving woman named Anna, had taken great pride in their sanctuary. She had plastered the interior dirt walls with a mixture of local clay and water, smoothened it into a hard, durable surface, and then painted it with a bright, reflective whitewash made from lime. The floor was packed earth, swept so relentlessly that it felt like polished stone. Thick woven rag rugs covered the ground. The small deep-set windows, aligned with larger windows cut into the south wall of the outer wooden barn, allowed shafts of brilliant winter sunlight to penetrate the thick walls, illuminating the small wooden table, the sturdy beds tucked into the corners, and the ever-present kettle humming quietly on the small iron stove. It did not smell of manure. The continuous upward draft of the chimney ensured that the air was always moving from the clean inner room out toward the barn, never the other way around. It smelled of dry earth, of wood smoke, of baking bread, and faintly, comfortingly, of warm hay. December arrived, and with it came the first true tests of the winter. Standard storms that dropped a foot of snow and pushed the temperatures down to zero. The community managed these storms with the usual suffering, burning massive amounts of coal, huddling near their stoves, and listening to the wind howl. Silas Thorne sat in his parlor, wrapped in a heavy wool sweater, feeding his large ornate stove and occasionally gazing out his frosted window toward the Vranik farm, shaking his head at the primitive folly of the immigrant. But in the middle of January, the ultimate test arrived. It began not with a howl, but with a terrifying, unnatural stillness. The barometric pressure plummeted so rapidly that the water in the settlers' wash basins seemed to hum. The sky turned a bruised, sickly shade of purple-gray, and the horizon vanished behind a solid, advancing wall of absolute white. This was not a normal normal winter storm. This was a generational atmospheric cataclysm, a massive polar vortex that swept down from the Canadian Shield with a ferocity that defied human comprehension. The wind did not merely blow, it shrieked with a deafening mechanical roar, a continuous concussive force that slammed into the wooden houses like a physical blow. The temperature did not just drop, it collapsed. Within 2 hours, the mercury plunged from a deceptive 20 degrees above zero to an agonizing 40 degrees below zero. The snow was so dense, so finely pulverized by the wind, that it became a blinding, suffocating fog, reducing visibility to less than 3 feet. Inside the towering white house of Silas Thorne, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The sheer velocity of the wind stripped the heat from the wooden walls faster than the massive parlor stove could generate it. The sawn lumber shrank in the extreme cold, opening microscopic gaps between the boards. Through these tiny fissures, the wind drove the fine crystalline snow straight into the house. The snow drifted across the fine Persian carpets in the parlor. It piled up on the sills of the single-pane glass windows, which were entirely opaque with inches of solid fractal ice. Silas, his arrogance entirely shattered by the sheer existential terror of the freezing cold, shoveled coal into the stove until the cast iron glowed a dull, angry red. But it was useless. The heat rose straight up to the high ceilings and was instantly sucked out through the uninsulated roof and the drafting walls. If you stood 3 feet away from the glowing stove, you could see your breath billowing in thick white clouds. If you stood 10 feet away, the water in a glass would freeze solid within minutes. By the second night of the relentless blizzard, Silas Thorne realized with a cold, sickening dread that his family was going to die. His wife and 2 children were huddled beneath every blanket they owned, piled onto the sofa mere inches from the stove, shivering violently, their lips turning a dangerous shade of blue. The coal supply, which he had thought would last a month, was nearly exhausted, consumed in a desperate, futile attempt to heat the unheatable. The wooden frame of the house groaned and shrieked in the gale, sounding as though it might shatter into splinters at any moment. Conventional wisdom had failed him completely. His money, his fine milled lumber, his tall ceilings, they were all worthless against the absolute power of the Arctic wind. Desperation breeds a frantic clarity. Silas knew that if the fire died, they would freeze to death in their own parlor before dawn. He remembered the thick, dark walls he had mocked. He remembered the quiet certainty in Elias Vranik's eyes. He made the hardest, most humiliating decision of his life. He wrapped his wife and children in heavy woolen carpets, tied the bundles tight with thick rope, and forced them out the front door into the screaming white void. The journey from the Thorne house to the Vranik farm was only a quarter of a mile, but in the heart of the blizzard it was an agonizing blind crawl through a landscape of pure nightmare. The cold bit into their lungs like shattered glass. The wind repeatedly knocked them to the ground. Silas navigated entirely by feel, finding the wire of the property fence and dragging his family along it, hand over frozen hand, his mind entirely consumed by the singular, desperate hope that the mad bohemian had been right. When Silas finally bumped into the massive, solid wall of Elias's wooden barn, he nearly wept with relief. He pounded frantically on the heavy double doors, his frozen fists making little sound over the roar of the wind. Moments later, the door swung inward, and Elias stood there, a lantern in his hand, his broad face impassive, but his eyes quickly taking in the desperate situation. He reached out, grabbed Silas by the collar of his frozen coat, and hauled him and his bundled family inside, slamming the heavy wooden doors shut against the storm. The contrast was immediate and entirely shocking. The moment the doors closed, the deafening shriek of the wind was instantly muted, reduced to a dull, distant rumble. The air inside the barn was cold, certainly, but it was perfectly still. The utter absence of the wind felt like a physical weight being lifted from Silas's chest. In the dim light of the lantern, Silas could see the massive shapes of the draft horses and the dairy cows standing quietly in their stalls, chewing their cud. He could smell the earthy, biological scent of the animals, a smell he had previously found offensive, but which now smelled undeniably, miraculously, like life. The ambient heat generated by the massive beasts was palpable, warming the still air of the barn to a temperature well above freezing, even as the world outside plunged to 40 below. Elias did not speak. He simply gestured for Silas to follow him towards the center of the barn. There, rising from the floor, were the thick, massive walls of the sod room, the earthen bricks completely invisible in the gloom, save for the bright, golden light spilling from the small, deep-set windows. Elias reached the heavy, thick wooden door of the inner sanctuary, lifted the iron latch, and pushed it open. The revelation that struck Silas Thorne at that moment was profound, an absolute shattering of everything he had believed about architecture, civilization, and survival. As the door opened, a wave of profound, enveloping warmth washed over him. It was not the sharp, localized, desperate heat of a roaring coal stove fighting a losing battle. It was a deep, pervasive, massive warmth radiating evenly from every surface in the room. The 3-foot thick walls of Earth, having absorbed the gentle heat of a small stove and the ambient warmth of the preheated air for weeks, were now acting as a massive thermal battery, holding the cold at bay with absolute impenetrable certainty. Silas stepped into the room, his boots thudding softly on the rag rugs over the packed earth floor. He stood there, trembling uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from the sudden, overwhelming shock of the heat. Anna Vranik was sitting quietly at the small table, darning a woolen sock. The 3 Vranik children were playing a game with carved wooden blocks on the floor. None of them were wearing coats, none of them were shivering. Elias walked past Silas, set his lantern down on a small shelf, and casually unbuttoned the top of his light cotton work shirt. Silas looked around the whitewashed room, noting the total absence of frost on the deep window sills, listening to the gentle, steady draft of the small iron stove that required only a few small pieces of wood every hour to maintain the temperature. He realized with a deep, humbling clarity that while he had built a monument to his own vanity that was currently freezing his family to death, Elias Vranek had built a fortress of applied physics. He had nested a thermal mass inside a windbreak, utilizing the forgotten old-world wisdom of shared biological heat, and in doing so, he had completely neutralized the deadliest environment on Earth. "My God, Vranek," Silas whispered, his voice cracking as the ice began to melt from his beard, dripping onto the clean, swept floor. "You saved us. Your madness. It is the only sane thing in this entire territory." Elias looked at the wealthy merchant, his expression calm, completely devoid of triumph or vindication. He pulled out a heavy wooden chair and gestured for Silas to sit near the stove. "Take off your coat, Mr. Thorne," Elias said quietly, his voice steady and low. "You will overheat. The earth holds the warmth." For 3 days, the massive blizzard raged across the plains, burying the landscape under towering drifts of white, killing thousands of head of cattle that had been left exposed on the open range, and claiming the lives of dozens of settlers who had trusted their survival to thin wooden walls and cast iron stoves. But inside the dark, quiet sanctuary of the barn, nestled within the 3-foot thick walls of the sod room, the Vranek family and the Thorne family weathered the cataclysm in absolute comfort. They shared meals cooked on the small stove. They listened to the quiet breathing of the animals in the outer aisle. They existed in a state of perfectly balanced thermal equilibrium, completely isolated from the deadly chaos of the storm raging just a few feet away. When the wind finally broke and the sky cleared to a brilliant, agonizingly bright, freezing blue, Silas Thorne emerged from the barn a fundamentally changed man. He waded through the waist-deep snow back to his towering white house, finding the interior entirely coated in a thick layer of frost, the water pipes burst, the potted plants frozen solid, a beautiful, empty shell that had utterly failed its primary purpose. He did not rebuild the interior. Instead, he became the most fervent, vocal advocate for the methods of the quiet bohemian immigrant. He used his standing in the community to ensure the idea was heard, respected, and adopted. The aftermath of the Great Storm saw a profound shift in the architectural philosophy of the surrounding territory. The community, having witnessed the undeniable, life-saving superiority of Elias's design, abandoned their pride and embraced the forgotten wisdom of thermal mass. Over the next few years, dozens of families adopted variations of the Korsgaard winter room. They built massive, thick-walled sod structures, sometimes inside existing barns, sometimes building heavy timber shells around new earthen homes. They learned to utilize the radiant heat of their livestock, they learned the value of that airspace, and they learned that true resilience comes not from fighting the environment with brute force, but from understanding its laws and adapting to them with quiet, methodical ingenuity. The legacy of Elias Vranik was not written in grand monuments or towering buildings, but in the quiet, steady survival of a community that learned to respect the earth beneath their feet. His story forces us to zoom out, to look beyond our modern reliance on complex, fragile systems of power and artificial heating, and to reconsider the profound, elegant simplicity of the old-world knowledge. The central thesis of his survival is as relevant today as it was over a century ago. True shelter is not merely a barrier against the elements, it is an intelligent, symbiotic relationship with the environment. It is the understanding that mass holds energy, that wind steals heat, and that sometimes the most sophisticated technological solution is a wall of densely packed dirt and the shared warmth of the living creatures around us. We see echoes of his design today in modern concepts of passive solar heating, in the growing movement of green architecture that utilizes earth-burned walls, and in the critical understanding of thermal bridging in highly insulated homes. Elias Vranik did not invent the laws of thermodynamics, he simply possessed the humility and the quiet brilliance to listen to them when everyone else was screaming against the wind. He proved that human ingenuity, when grounded in the fundamental truths of nature, can create a sanctuary of warmth in the very heart of the absolute cold. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past, for taking the time to listen to a story of quiet competence and forgotten wisdom. If you found value in this narrative, if you appreciate the deep dive into the practical history of human survival, we strongly encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with anyone who appreciates the history of true resilience. Your support is what allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten stories, to keep the quiet triumphs of men like Elias Franick alive, and to share the vital lessons of the past with the modern world. Before you go, we want to hear from you. What other old-world technologies or forgotten unconventional methods do you think could solve a modern problem we face today? Who in your own life possessed that quiet, stubborn ingenuity, the kind of person who taught you the small, steady skills of building, fixing, or surviving when conventional wisdom failed? Let us know in the comments below and tell us where you are watching from as we continue to build this community of history and practical knowledge. Please remember that this narrative is a historically inspired reconstruction created for educational and storytelling purposes. While the scientific principles of thermal mass, convection, and insulation discussed here are completely accurate, this content does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or legal advice, and any modern construction or survival applications must always adhere to current building codes and safety guidelines.